Good evening and welcome back to SF Commons. Tonight we're talking about the $1.25 trillion national security state budget for the fiscal year 2020.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
We're delighted to have with us tonight Mandy Smithberger, who is the director of the Defense Center of the Government Oversight Project, which was formed in 1981, a non-profit, nonpartisan organization which aim is to study, investigate, and expose government abuses, fraud, and waste in the federal sector. Welcome, Mandy. How are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I went through your article, which is exemplary. You broke down the $1.25 trillion national security state defense budget. A lot of people don't know that. When people talk about military spending, it only showed $750 billion. But in here you covered pretty much in detail that in fact it's not $750 billion, but it's $1.25 trillion in our expenditures. So could you run through those numbers again?
Absolutely. So I think it's easy to forget the many aspects of our national security that are being funded, and that it's not just through the Pentagon. So the number that you referenced, the $750 billion, that is made up of both the base budget for the Department of Defense and made up of the war budget. Now, the war budget has actually not been strictly used for war. In fact, only about $25 billion of over $100 billion that was requested for this year's budget was going to be for actual war needs. And in many other occasions, we've seen only about half of that budget actually goes towards the war. Instead, it goes towards a slush fund of other programs and priorities for both the Congress and the Department of Defense. So that's kind of the $750 billion. Then it's important to look at not only what happens in our wars overseas, but what happens when people come home afterwards. And so when we're looking at the national security state budget, it's important to look at the cost of the VA as well, which is over $200 billion. So that's taking care of men and women in uniform, who are injured, concerns about PTSD, and this is what we owe them for their sacrifice for that year. Other aspects are funding for intelligence. Obviously, it's important to think about keeping the homeland safe, and that's not just the Department of Defense, that's also the FBI and defense-related funding, which is about $9 billion, the Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department as well for our diplomatic and aid efforts to keep us safe. And when you bring all of that together, you have $1.25 trillion.
The Homeland Security was formed after 9/11, and
Right.
basically it swallowed 22 different defense, military-related type organizations. And it has about over 250,000 employees. But the majority of the monies are spent with federal contracts, with federal contractors. Why do they have so much influence? The motivation is there to just keep on manufacturing all these wars.
You see so much spending in many of these accounts is because of what we sometimes refer to as political engineering, so spreading out contracts across congressional districts so that every member of Congress has skin in the game and doesn't want to really cancel programs or hold them accountable. My organization, the Project on Government Oversight, did a study to look at just how cost effective it is to outsource some of these jobs, and we found that in a number of cases, those jobs could be performed at a much more cost effective way if they were done by federal civilian employees. So it's not only continued cost growth, but we really don't see adequate control of how to control future cost growth.
About half of the DoD budget goes to defense contractors. Is that roughly right? Okay.
That sounds about right, yes.
I think at the top of the list is Lockheed Martin.
That would be one of the top 5, absolutely.
Okay. Answer me this one. As I understand that, I'm looking at the revenue, 2016 defense revenues that went to Lockheed Martin is roughly $43 billion. And I'm just kind of curious, the CEO of that corporation received, what was it, $20 million? Over $20 million in compensation. Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, over 90% of the business was the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. In other words, we're giving this guy roughly an $18 million salary from the taxpayers of this country. Does that sound right to you? Is that something that we might want to look at and say when we give, I don't know what the salary is of the Secretary of Defense, what is it, $150,000, $200,000? Mm-hmm. Does it make sense to you that we pay the Secretary of Defense $200,000 or less, and we give a contractor who gets 92% of his revenue from the taxpayer of this country $18 million of taxpayer money? Is that something that you might want to look at? I think that might be an issue that you might want to raise. All right? This is essentially, for all intent and purposes, Lockheed Martin is a government agency, if you like, private, but a government agency, virtually fully funded by the United States government. Mm-hmm. Is it reasonable to say that they keep their CEO salaries in check? Or should the taxpayers be paying exorbitant salaries?
So yes, the largest beneficiaries of excessive Pentagon spending are the largest defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon. And so when you see these calls for increased budgets, you think that you're going to be spending more money on troops, but in many cases what you're doing is you're just lining the pockets of these defense contractors. And in many cases, it's for weapon systems that we're seeing really aren't working and aren't being effective. The kind of perfect case study for this is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. It's the largest Pentagon's weapons program in its history. We are not done testing these planes yet. We've purchased hundreds of them. There are concerns that we're not going to be able to afford to make the retrofits necessary to address the problems identified in testing. But you also have programs like the Ford-class carrier, where the first one is going to cost close to $14 billion for just a single aircraft carrier. And so throughout the budget, you see a number of unaffordable programs. And the reason that they become unaffordable is because we have runaway Pentagon spending.
Members of Congress, I mean, a lot of them are very smart people. Why do they sit back and accept what's being advertised, that the budget is only $750 billion, when in fact $1.25 trillion? Why is Congress part of that a mission.
President Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. Originally, his speech mentioned that it should also include Congress as part of that equation. Defense contractors have undue influence over our policy-making process. That's through campaign contributions. That's by spreading these contracts out across congressional districts. It's treating Pentagon spending as a jobs program. We have a pernicious issue of the revolving door, where members of Congress, their staff, and senior Pentagon officials go on to work for these defense contractors. And if they're thinking about their future payday, they're not thinking always about what's in the best interest of our military, what's in the best interest of our safety and national security. They're thinking about what they're going to do next to profit off of their public service.
The American people are forced to live in an austerity program. We have a $1.6 trillion student debt. We go bankrupt because of medical expenses, there are 45 million American people living at poverty level. There's over 500,000 people homeless at any single night. The kids are struggling with trying to get an education. So where's our priority? Nobody's attacking the U.S.
So I think that it's important for the American people to look at these levels of spending and really think if they reflect their values. And I think a lot of the issues that you raised suggest that our budget doesn't actually reflect our values and our morals, and it doesn't show a budget that's prioritizing taking care of the American people. There are a number of proposals out there that propose cutting Pentagon funding significantly in ways that won't undermine our safety and could actually enhance our security. There are proposals from the Sustainable Defense Task Force. The Project on Government Oversight has done its own study. The Poor People's Campaign has also looked at opportunities to shift funding from the Pentagon to other domestic priorities. So I think as we go into the incoming presidential elections, it's important to have a robust debate about what are our priorities and does our budget actually reflect what we want.
When you look at Congress, every time there's a vote for the military budget, it's bipartisan. Both the Republicans and the Democrats, they're both very eager to vote on this military budget.
Enough questions about what the Department of Defense is doing with our money. They're the only major federal agency that's been unable to pass an audit. There are a number of weapons programs that are over cost and behind schedule. There are a number of reasons for us to believe that the Pentagon is not being a good steward of the taxpayer dollar, and that I think we should have the same standard for any federal agency. We should hold them accountable for how much they spend and what they accomplish. And unfortunately, the Department of Defense has largely been held unaccountable.
First of all, let's talk about intelligence. In Syria, for instance, the military in the Pentagon are fighting with the folks in the CIA. There are 17 intelligence agencies. The 17th intelligence agency was created to supervise the other 16.
It's important to look at whether we think the way that our intelligence community is organized is actually modern and serving our needs. There are concerns about the number of agencies, whether there's duplication that's occurring between these agencies. So I think that's another area of the budget that is ripe for scrutiny. Unfortunately, it does not get very much scrutiny because a lot of it is behind classification. And so it becomes that much more important for the few committees that can look into these programs to conduct robust oversight.
Also questions of the influence of foreign governments to our own government. Say, for instance, when it comes to foreign policy, countries that are actually being financed by our tax dollars, like Israel, has a lot of influence. Saudi Arabia.
So there are a couple of concerns there. One, arms sales should only be a tool of foreign policy. It shouldn't be the foreign policy. And there are concerns that in this administration, State Department officials are being pressured to make arms sales a priority. And again, that's serving primarily the interest of the defense industry and not really thinking about what's in our best national security interests. I would also say that our foreign lobbying laws are horrifically outdated, that there are a lot of people that you assume are going to be independent experts on these issues, people at think tanks, people who are lobbyists on different kinds of issues. And they're not always disclosing who's actually paying their bills and how they're trying to shape the policy environment. And so until those laws are modernized, I think, unfortunately, the American people has a very difficult time in assessing whether they can trust these different voices on our policy issues and whether they are giving us the best advice in our national security.
In Afghanistan, right now there are 18-year-old kids who are being sent to war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan has been going on for 18 years. Close to 70% are against these perpetual wars. And yet, there does not seem to be an end in sight.
I think it's deeply concerning that Afghanistan is becoming an endless war. I think this is where we really see that Congress is not performing their constitutional duties when it comes to both declaring war and actually conducting oversight. I think most members of Congress would have a difficult time saying what we're actually accomplishing there. I think at the very least they should be voting on these kinds of issues, but over and over they've been shirking that responsibility, and it's really a dereliction of duty because our men and women in uniform need to have the support of the American people when they fight overseas. And
the Congress has, according to the Constitution, it has the power to declare war. So they says no more support in Yemen. The president vetoed that. And now the killing continues, the starvation, the blockades of the Yemeni people continues.
Isn't actually accountability that Congress really needs to show, not only this president, but any president, that they're serious about their constitutional duties. And if that the president is going to override their votes when they want the U.S. to withdraw support, then they need to take away money. And as long as they continue to throw more money at the Pentagon, the attorneys of the department take that as consent for what is done in our name. And while I don't think that is correct, we need to fundamentally change the conversation around this budget and accountability if we want to see change.
Why is it so hard for a member of Congress to vote against the military? Could you explain that?
Well, so I would say it's not a vote against the military. I think it's an important duty that every member of Congress think very seriously about when they think it is appropriate to send our men and women in uniform into harm's way. So I don't think, voting against a budget that's excessively high means that you're not supporting the troops. I think the way that you support the troops is you say, okay, how was that money spent? How safe are our men and women in uniform? Is the equipment that they're using safe? Is it effective? Are they getting the training that they need? And those questions aren't being asked. Instead, they're just mostly asking, how much more do you need?
When you think about the national security, one would think that diplomacy should be a big part of that. How much does our government spend on diplomacy?
Right. It's really a pittance how much we spend on diplomacy when you compare what we spend on the Department of Defense. And I think sometimes you're seeing the result of that by not really having a diplomacy-focused strategy. It means that we're not really taking good care of our allies. I'm deeply concerned about how much we've just seen the State Department decimated over the past couple of years. I think there's more volatility than necessary to be happening. I think part of our strength as a nation is in our alliances and taking care of them, and a lot of that should be a diplomatic-led effort. But as long as the Pentagon has more money, they are going to be the ones calling the shots.
And never had in history passed an audit. They had $21 trillion missing that they cannot account for.
That audit that the Army was unable to track $21 trillion worth of transactions is mind-boggling, obviously.
How do you do that?
So again, I think that's where you see that they have financial systems in place where there really isn't any kind of check to make sure that they are legitimate transactions, and most importantly, that they have the documents to show that that transaction amount is accurate. And this is part of the broader issue of the Department of Defense isn't able to pass a financial audit. And it took them years to even be in the position to find out that they could fail one. That's how weak our financial systems are for the Department of Defense, that we don't have the kinds of internal controls that we need, that we would expect of any other federal agency, to make sure that they're being responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars.
Exactly.
Well, I think there are some genuine threats that we have to be concerned about, but it's important that we have an effective strategy as to how to address them. And I think there are a lot of reasons to look at how we've conducted our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to say that actually those wars haven't furthered our national security objectives.
No, they killed, 1.2 million people? Oh my God. I mean, that's just unbelievable.
Right, so I think we're overdue for really fundamentally rethinking our approach to national security, that we need to look at our diplomatic options. We need to look at the opportunities that we have through trade and other ways to collaborate with the world so that it's not always a military-first strategy.
There seems to be an overwhelming direction to invade countries, the regime changes, the intervention, the actual wars, the strategizing for wars. And mainly, it's for oil. It's for natural. It's for these people's natural resources. So when you're talking about companies that benefits, it's the oil companies, isn't it? For the most part, and the defense contractors and the weapons manufacturers.
Right. No, I think in a number of these cases, we are seeing wars that further the interests of corporations and not wars that actually advance our national security interests. I urge you to look at the levels of subsidies a lot of these companies get from taxpayers as well. Yeah, I think it's very important for the American people to question these levels of spending and what's being done with their money. I think, unfortunately, too many people think that they can't have influence over the democratic process and the policy process. And I would just urge, your viewers to really be active. I think they underestimate the power of their voices, and especially when it comes to national security spending. Lawmakers disproportionately hear from defense contractors. They don't hear from ordinary people. So if they think that ordinary people are watching and they care, it's going to change their behavior and it's going to make it better. The whole federal budget is $4.7 trillion, and so the national security state makes up $1.25 trillion of that spending. So some of that spending is entitlement spending, so Social Security, Medicare, different things that people have earned through working. So we have a gigantic budget. That level of spending and the levels of deficits that we're seeing, it becomes that much more important to look at where are there opportunities to save, where are there opportunities to be more effective.
Yeah, that's $1.25 trillion out of $4.7 trillion budget. That's more than a quarter, right?
Right. It depends on who you talk to. Some people would like to see it be like 50% of the budget.
Well,
yeah, I think $1.25 trillion is a lot of money. I think it's more money than anyone can picture. And I think that our budget should reflect our values. And right now, I think it reflects the values of defense contractors. I don't think it reflects the values of the American people.
To support the important amendment brought forth by Congressman Dellums and Congresswoman Waters. Sometimes I think that the people in this institution and in the White House are really losing contact and not knowing what's going on with the American people. In case you don't know, and you haven't seen the latest polls, the American people hold the President of the United States in contempt. They hold this institution in contempt. They hold the Republican Party in contempt. They hold the Democratic Party in contempt. They think that maybe, given all of the crises facing this country, it's about time that there was some bold leadership here and that this institution made some hard choices. And this is what the choice is about. We are spending $270 billion a year on the military, but we don't have a major enemy. I know it hurts your feelings. I know you're upset about it. I know you're hoping and praying that maybe we'll have another war. Maybe somebody will rise up. But it ain't happening. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. The Warsaw Pact is through. Who are you worried about? Iraq? Panama? Who are you worried about? I'll tell you who I'm worried about. I'm worried about the fact that our workers are seeing a decline in their standard of living. They want to see our industry be rebuilt. That's what they want to see. No more B-2 bombers, no more Star Wars. Let's make the quality products we need. Let's invest in American industry. No, I won't yield. The American people want to see our kids educated. They want a Head Start program. They want their kids to be able to go to college. They want to wipe out the fact that 5 million children in this country go to bed hungry. They want child care for their kids. They want decent education. Let's have the guts to give some leadership to this country. The Cold War's over. Let's reinvest in America. Let's support this amendment.
Thank you for joining us again. See you next time. Good night.